Okay. Welcome. It's good to be here. Let me wait till. Yeah. Okay. Welcome. Okay. There we go. Good to be here. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Eclipse and in a way that may be of interest to this group, and to talk about what Eclipse does and the things that it's best at. It's helpful to go back and talk about some history, why we started it, how we got to where we are today. Before I do that, let me a little bit about the mission. It's about advancing open source and the communities around open source and ecosystems. And throughout my whole presentation, you'll hear there's this marriage between open source and free, and open source and free and commercial and making money. And it's about the marriage of those two goals. And our vision is to be this leading community that helps organizations collaborate in the open and also make money from that collaboration. So a little bit about background, talk about Eclipse today, membership, what that means, and probably more importantly, working groups, and then how sort of the governance around that, how those work, and then open source projects and how those work at Eclipse. So this is going way back. This is 25 years ago, and in IBM we had some challenges around the tools that didn't integrate. We were writing lots of things over and over again. I think when we did this originally, for any of you database guys who build SQL, there are graphical SQL builders. You drag this, you get SQL, you put it in a table, you stick that in here. We had like 18 different ones in IBM. Everybody wrote their own. And so part of this was sort of getting our house in order inside of IBM, replacing some brittle technology. I don't know if any of you guys remember Visual Age and Visual Age for Java. The core of that actually was half Smalltalk. That's what we started with, and eventually we moved that to Java. We wanted to grow an ecosystem around Java-based middleware, around, at the time it was our WebSphere brand, bring partners to that. And the big, on the horizon, the big darkness on the horizon was Microsoft and Visual Studio, and sort of combating that in IBM. And so, and what we went around several times and we tried commercial licenses, we tried a partner program, none of that worked. And in the end, we decided to do an open source project. And we got agreement with IBM, within IBM, to do that, and it's explaining it as a means to beat our business goals. And we were lucky. In fact, the general manager in charge of that, John Swainson, came back and gave a talk at the 10-year anniversary of Eclipse, and he talked about the things that he would have done differently in that decision. And I can remember that decision process. We got rejected initially, and literally the question we got was, "Are you guys on drugs?" Right? You want to contribute $40 million of software to the open source community? Are you guys on drugs? We weren't, that I know of, but and eventually we got the approval to do it, and so we created this Eclipse consortium and the open source project. And the consortium was just this loose confederation. It was a one-page agreement, right? And it was really a handshake. But behind that, IBM, it was still running on IBM hardware. The steward of the consortium was an IBM employee, and that in the end proved to be a big hurdle. But it was 9 members, most of whom aren't here anymore. A lot of change in this space. TogetherSoft, IBM bought Rational. Borland's no longer, WebGain's no longer, but it was a good mix of both partners and competitors, which gave it a little bit of credibility. But we did institutionalize this separation of concerns. It was an open source license, and it was a license friendly to commercial exploitation. And so we announced it. It was in November in 2001, and we hit every major media outlet that day. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. We got slashdotted. It was pretty big news, and our servers crashed. So this predates cloud computing. This was one of our download servers, and it crashed that day. And so it caused us to, we had a little bit of work to do on our infrastructure. But but as I said, it still was a consortium. It still was this loose confederation. This was running on IBM hardware. And so we decided to, and this was in 2004, to separate it, to make it its own legal entity. We incorporated the Eclipse Foundation as a not-for-profit. It's a 501c4, which is a trade association. And we did it to sort of really formally separate it from IBM, because there were several big players that weren't joining. And we believed that was because it still really was IBM. We had several more that were sort of sitting on the sidelines that were just watching. And it was convenient to watch if you didn't want to join. Some issues we're trying to solve around intellectual property, and just this basic, like, we want to do a trade show, right? We want to do something here, but who's going to pay for it, right? And if you guys ever worked with procurement in big organizations, that's a nightmare, right? So we wanted a way to make that easier for groups of people to do. And so 2004, not-for-profit with a professional staff. And Mike Milinkovich, the group that did this hired Mike Milinkovich, who was with Oracle at the time as the executive director. He was the first employee. He is still there today as the executive director, and the staff has grown. I think I might have a number on the staff here a little bit later. Yeah, there we go. So today, it started with one project, which was the IDE. Actually, let me back up. The original Eclipse was just the platform. It was just an integration platform. And we weren't getting the uptake by the tool vendors that we wanted. So the decision to open source the Java IDE was actually a secondary one. We decided to do that as a way to illustrate the platform, and then then this would showcase the platform and drive requirements, which we feed back and then into the platform. And I mean, you guys are familiar with Java. That proved to be a really important decision to open source that Java IDE. Anyway, so you see 375 projects, 330 members, 1,600 committers, a lot of code, 13 billion in shared investment from all the committers, 35 staff. I'll talk more about the working groups here, 14 working groups that we've got going. I'll talk a little bit more about the various membership levels, but the sort of the key, the brain trust that drives Eclipse are the strategic members. And you can see the US, Asia. And over time, this membership, it was almost uniformly US when we started. Then we started getting more in Europe, and now we're more heavily weighted toward Europe. You'll see, which is causing us to add to our incorporation status. But these guys, membership dues are based on revenue. And if you're a strategic member, it's up to $250,000 or euro. They're about the same now per year. But that gets you a seat on the Eclipse Foundation Board of Directors, which is important because I mentioned this open source and commercial, and there's a place where they come together, and in the middle of where they come together has to do with licensing and intellectual property policies. And if you want to have a vote on those, you get a seat on the board of directors. So just sort of positioning open source, maybe a little continuum here. You've got GitHub. I'm sure most of you guys have something in GitHub or use something from GitHub. It's a thriving developer community, high quality. There's actually low quality code there, but a lot of high quality code. So all kinds of code at GitHub. You go to a single vendor open source project like Visual Studio Code, single source from Microsoft. Quality code, I can say that because the guy that leads it, Eric Gamma, is also the guy that wrote the Java IDE for Eclipse. Super smart team, good piece of work, single vendor open source. And so it's good code, and also that single vendor can drive the marketing in the partner program. And you get Eclipse Foundation. We have a thriving developer community. We have high quality code. We do marketing and evangelization for the projects in the member companies. In addition, we've defined some processes around the open source projects and this vendor neutral governance model and I mentioned the intellectual property and licensing policies that makes it easier to commercialize the open source project, to put it open source code, to put it in a commercial offering. Yeah, for example, if you want to, you can take Eclipse binaries and you can put them under a commercial license, right? You can't put the code under a commercial license, but you can put the binaries under commercial license, which is important for some companies, and putting that in a commercial product and putting that under commercial license. So one of the things that we discovered, and part of my job at IBM, and this was not one of the favorite parts of my job at IBM, was there's a lot of code at Eclipse. In the early days, each project sort of ran itself. There was, sort of nominal Eclipse. There were some Eclipse processes in place, but each project decided sort of their dependencies, when they would lease, did they externalize strings? Did they test for this? Did they, And what we were trying to do in IBM was consume a bunch of this code and put it in a commercial product, but we had to bring it all together and make sure it all worked together. And so that was a lot of work, right? So bringing it together, testing it, making sure it worked on all the different locales that we had to run on, making sure strings were externalized, translating, doing a software bill of materials, scanning the code. Just, if you guys do commercial development, this is all stuff, the Gorpy stuff we got to go through and do. Working with our other strategic members, basically it should have been obvious, but everybody's doing this, right? All the commercial companies are doing this, right? So wait a minute, why? We started Eclipse so that we all didn't have to write the same code, right? We're going to collaborate on this stuff that doesn't drive value. We're going to compete here on the stuff that does drive value. Well, the same thing applies to some of the business processes. So at Eclipse, we agreed that we would institute some processes to sort of bring this together, and that led to some intellectual property changes, and I don't know if there are any license changes, but most importantly, we got on this release train. Right. Finally, the project leads got together, and you could opt in, but we said, okay, we said Eclipse 3.0, 3.1, and then we started with these names, Callisto, Europa, Ganymede, but you could opt in, and there was a release train, right? And so you released and you lined up and you tested and you were part of this download that all this stuff works together. And that worked well. We just enforced a bit more discipline. It was more predictable to commercial software developers. Predictability is important. And yeah, that continues today. And so this in this evolution of open source and companies coming together and collaborating at one level and competing at another, we sort of came to this realization that sort of structure is important, and there's a lot of value there, right? We've got this governance, this collaboration on open source, this value line, and then competition happens above that level. One of the manifestations of this is it was early on when we were what license are we going to offer this under, right? The IBM at the time had something called the IBM Public License, which was it was an OSI approved license, and it had a weak copyleft provision, right? Which well, if you're unfamiliar with that, basically, if you change code, you have to make your change code available, but you don't have to make your code available, right? And you can combine this with your code. When we started Eclipse, we just erased IBM, and I can't remember what we put in there, but we called it the Common Public License, right? But it was essentially the same license. It was OSI approved. Then when we started Eclipse, we took that license and I think if I remember right, what we did is we added some words about patents in there to cover that, but then renamed it to be the Eclipse Public License. But it included the capability for a company to redistribute the binaries, at the time this is all Java, the Java binaries under a commercial license, right? Which is companies selling this stuff what they wanted to do, what they needed to do.
Is it okay if you ask questions?
I'm sorry, absolutely. And I should have said that at the beginning. Thank you.
Okay, so then to me, it seems that's maybe the key differentiator between the Apache public license, which also has something about patents, and the Eclipse public license, that you can dual license your code more easily.
So you can, without, we could really go into the weeds on this one. If you own the copyright, if you write something and you own the copyright, you can put it under as many licenses as you want. At Eclipse, originally, everything had to be the Eclipse public license. And then, and I think what came next, we had some overlap with Apache. And so we decided to, and that was the intellectual property policy, was you can only license it under Eclipse. And at the time, there was this undercurrent, this fear of LGPL and GPL. We wouldn't let any of those in, right? Well, we've sort of got past that now. But we started to get more overlap with Apache, and I don't recall the first project, but we finally realized that there really was no harm in allowing a project to be dual licensed. And so, but that required a change to the Eclipse intellectual property policy, which was voted on by the board, right? So you had to be a member of the board of the directors to have that kind of say in, is that allowed? And we really have gone much past that now. We have, a bunch of different kinds of license. I don't think we have any LGPL Eclipse now. And specifically, we prohibit GPL and AGPL licenses.
Another question to this I had earlier. What's roughly the percentage of developers who contribute, who are part of one of the Eclipse members of the foundation, and people from outside?
So that's a darn good question, and one to which I do not know the answer. But if you could, I will, I'll see you after, and I'll give you contact information. If you could send that to me and remind me, I will get an answer to that. I know who knows the answer. I just don't happen to know that. So on that topic, we're gonna compete at one level, and we're gonna collaborate at another. It was our first or second Eclipse conference. The guys from JPL that were working on the Mars rover, they came and they gave a talk. They were huge Eclipse fans. They called it the Eclipse IDE. Huge Eclipse fans, and they got up and gave a talk how if you guys do any Eclipse work, you've got Eclipse the IDE and the tool platform. Eclipse can also just be a general workstation, right, as Eclipse RCP, Rich Client Platform. These guys predated that by years, right? They had taken it apart. They were using it as the structure to build the user interface to control the Spirit and Discovery Mars rovers. And we didn't know this, right? They came in and gave this talk, and this was one of their slides. But the guy who was giving the talk, his words were, he said, we do telemetry stuff. We do, control stuff. We don't do IDEs and desktop software. This is just a more efficient use of taxpayer dollars, right? We're going to build on top of what you guys have given us. So now, where are we today? Where's the Eclipse Foundation today? Where are we spending our energy and our time? Cloud native Java, IoT and edge, automotive, and tools. Those are the main areas. And what Eclipse provides, and I've talked about a lot of this, is the governance and the processes, the ecosystem developing marketing, the IP management and licensing, and the infrastructure. I'll go into a little bit more detail here. Right, so the governance and processes, the Eclipse development process, and so you'll see one of our working groups is the Jakarta working group. This is Eclipse EE that was with Oracle that moved to the Eclipse Foundation. But with that move came the mission to do a spec and a TCK to go along with that spec. And we And that caused Eclipse to redo some of its processes and institute some new processes, because you handle a spec and a TCK for a spec different than you handle an open source project and the source code around that. Right, the vendor neutral governance, you've got, so the legal entity, the bylaws, the member agreement, the antitrust policies. So that last one is really important. When you get a bunch of commercial companies collaborating, they're in all of the geographies around the world, there are antitrust laws, right? You can't collude, right? You can't thwart the market, the open market. And what Eclipse provides in its processes, and really it's much, both the processes and the open structure, is a way to for these companies to collaborate without running afoul of antitrust laws around the world. I talked about the project lifecycle, and a key point, this is just about the governance. Technical decisions remain with the committers and the project leads. Eclipse found foundation staff, none of us make technical decisions. They're all made by the committers themselves. So with the staff to assist with recruitment, so this is recruiting other members, right? I'll talk a little bit more about one of the projects I'm involved with at Johns Hopkins. They're trying to build a working group, and we're spending a lot of time looking around, recruiting other members that could want to collaborate with Johns Hopkins in this particular area. A marketing staff and event planners, right? So if you're familiar with the Cloud Dev Tools working group, there's an ID technology, a cloud ID technology called Theia that allows you to build. It was originally about building cloud IDs, but you can run a cloud ID in a browser. And we spent a lot of time building an ecosystem around Theia, helping the adopters. We do an open VSX registry in addition to the Microsoft registry to provide a vendor neutral place for VSX compliant plugins to be hosted. Those feed into Theia. We do TheiaCon, right? It's a virtual conference for Theia adopters. People are interested. So this is where the Eclipse Foundation is spending money that's been contributed by a number of different commercial companies. So I talked about most of this. So if you are gonna get, as a developer, right access to the GitHub repo, if you can merge PRs, you can put code there, you have to sign a committer agreement and a committer license agreement, right? Which is, if you do open source, you should be familiar with this. Or basically, you really commit good stuff. You're not going to copy somebody else's code, put it there. And trademarks for projects, right? Theia is an Eclipse owned trademark. Jakarta now is an Eclipse owned trademark. Infrastructure. So it's an open source organization. We provide open source infrastructure, CI/CD, web hosting, our SLA for that, see the uptime. And we also have relatively recently allowed projects to be hosted at GitHub, in addition to the Git that the Eclipse Foundation runs. Talk a little bit about the membership. So membership, there are different levels. And there's a lot that goes with each level. I just sort of highlighted the key things. At the top is a strategic level. Strategic and contributing are based on organization revenues, annual revenues. They're capped at $250,000 euros per year. Strategic gets your seat on the Eclipse board and the Architecture Council. That last one is a bit misleading. It provides guidance. It doesn't have really binding decisions. Again, those are the responsibility of the committers and the technical leads. And you can vote on bylaw, the IP policy, and licensing changes. Relatively recently, given the growth that we're at the Eclipse Foundation seeing in Europe, Eclipse has been incorporated in Germany. It is now also incorporated in Belgium. right? Just to grow the footprint there in Europe. We have a contributing member. It used to be called a solutions member. And it is, you get a lot of the same access and benefits except for a seat on the board. What you get is the opportunity to be elected to represent all of the committers, the contributing members. So let's say there are 50 contributing members, and based on the number of strategic members, that dictates the number of contributing members, right? I think it's a 1 to 8 or 1 to 10 ratio. And so let's say there are 15 strategic members. That means there are 2 contributing members, and those 50 will elect 2 representatives from that group of 50 to sit on the board of directors for a year. So it's a way to get in without really the same expenditure that a strategic level requires. An associate really is targeted for not-for-profits and research institutions. If you are a not-for-profit or a research institution, it doesn't cost anything to join as an associate member. You can, as an associate member, you can join a working group, which also have separate fees, okay, as a guest member, right? And you can participate as a guest member, and you don't vote on certain things in the working groups, but you get access. And then for the individuals that aren't part of the member companies, there is a committer level membership. And this is basically to get you the kinds of access you need to be a committer and to be part of the Eclipse Foundation. So here is, right, that's a bit of an eye test, but you can see that 250, actually I pulled this from a European presentation, hence the Euro symbol, but they're capped at 250,000 euros, or contributing, you can see is about 1/10 of that, 20. Okay, and then down here you can see for not-for-profits and research institutes, associate there are no membership fees. Okay, so working groups. So as we evolved Eclipse, what we came to realize is one of the key benefits, what we had built was this way for commercial companies to collaborate around open source. So we decided to institutionalize that as a working group. And in addition to collaborating on the base technology in a given area, if a group of companies want to come together and collaborate, it's a way to do that. It is based on the Eclipse Foundation development process, and it just allows them to collaborate on requirements and specs and marketing and test environments. And for example, I'm the community director, the program director for the Cloud DevTools working group, right? So this group of companies get together, their membership dues fund the infrastructure and the operations staff that runs openvsx.org, an OpenVSX registry. We do TheaCon, we spend money on the Cloud Tool Time seminars. When it comes time for EclipseCon, we'll spend money on swag for the conference that is specific to Cloud DevTools. So it's talked about requirements gathering, roadmaps, architecture discussion, certification of industry platforms, funding of joint development, and ecosystem and community development. Again, it's bringing companies together in a certain area, and I'll give you some examples of these areas, the stuff that we have going on now, and collaborating and pulling resources and owning agreements that would be difficult to own by any single participant member company. So the structure of the working groups, right? Eclipse Foundation members can join Eclipse working groups. There are additional membership fees. There are 2 tiers, a steering committee member and a participant member. And membership fees are tiered based on participation. And a participant member, much like a contributing member can be elected to the steering committee of a working group, right? So if you don't want to, so the current annual fees for the Cloud DevTools Working Group are 150,000 euros. So as a strategic member, a participant member, I think it's capped at 20. It's 20 or 15. But so it's a lot less. You don't get a vote on the steering committee, but you could be elected by this group of participant members to represent them all on the steering committee. Right, so the steering committee approves the charter, which really sets the scope, approves the budget, and that second line there is the most important. We pull these fees together, which, you know, for the Cloud DevTools Working Group this year is on the, I should know this figure off the top of my head, it's on the 350 to 400K euro range, but this group decides how that money is spent. So it's important to have, you know, a seat there. Right, and they have the ability to form committees or subcommittees. So here are the current working groups today. I mentioned the Cloud DevTools. So this is collaborating around cloud native tools and tool technologies. I mentioned Jakarta EE. So this is a move of Java EE from Oracle to the Eclipse Foundation with that specification work. There's a lot of automotive work here, software-defined vehicle, and the OpenPass is also automobile related. Again, these are automobile manufacturers and tier 1, tier 2 suppliers coming together to collaborate on software that they want to share in automobile. There's one here on a lot of IoT stuff. Onero's about standardizing an operating system for embedded devices. One that's not on here that I mentioned that I've started working with, we wanted to become a working group, is the library, the software engineers in the library organization at Johns Hopkins, working with Harvard and MIT, build a system that's currently just deployed at Johns Hopkins. But if you today are a research institution and you're getting public funds, there are likely open access requirements associated with your data and your research, right? You're going to get taxpayer dollars. You got to make available freely and openly what you find out, your data, your paper, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, there are a lot of different ways to do that in a lot of different places, and all of them are different. And plus, most of the major universities have their own open access requirements that are likely based on a different technology and have a different data model. And so what Johns Hopkins did, collaborating with these other guys, was they built this system called Public Access Submission System, which they have deployed at JHU, but it's a way for their research professionals to tie into, currently it's NIH and CDC, I think it is, but their repositories to pull their grant information in, to manage that, and to publish their results, right? Because it frees them of that burden. And so it's a software application built to do this. But you can imagine a lot of other universities and research institutions get funding, at least from those two organizations, as well as Department of Education, Health and Human Services. And so this effort, what we did was we took the work that had been happening on the inside of Johns Hopkins, so we started a new open source project at Eclipse called Eclipse Pass, which is that code. And we've mostly sort of severed it from the Johns Hopkins dependencies. So our goal is to initially deploy a demo system with fake data. So you can go in, you poke it, and you see, oh, this is how it works, right? This is how I get my grant information. This is how I publish my research. But ultimately, and use that to get additional people to participate, and then ultimately deploy a public production system at Eclipse that then individual universities could choose to host the open source project and run their own in-house and publish, externally. But we're thinking a lot probably won't if they don't have to. And so we can run one public production instance at Eclipse, that multi-tenant instance that different people can use to publish their results. But so that's an example where, right, again, we're coming together around open source technology, but there's a lot of other stuff we have to do around that, outside of that. And so just very concretely, right? So if I look at what I did here was I went through the Cloud DevTools budget and or program plan. So where are we spending our money, right? And so you can see we do general legal IP support. We fund the Eclipse. So we fund the Eclipse entity itself as a legal entity. The neutral infrastructure, website development and maintenance. This is both the Cloud DevTools site and openvsx.org. We build collateral, we promote all of the projects, we sponsor trade shows, we do analyst and press relations, both for Eclipse as well as specifically for these efforts. We do targeted market research, so we sponsor a cloud development paper. We do research and publish results of that, and then we, like, in addition to building the websites, we operate those. So, if you want to start a working group, right? You define a vision and scope, and you create a working group charter. You go out, if you go to Eclipse website, click on working group, pick any working group, you can see the charter. They're pretty straightforward. There's probably about 75% boilerplate, and then you've got, your specific piece of it. You get your initial list of participants, and then you establish your fee structure and your budget, and you get approved by the Eclipse Foundation Board of Directors. So I'm going to talk, we don't, 10 minutes, good. Talk a little bit about the open source projects themselves, but before I do so, any questions about working groups? Okay. So the way Eclipse projects are structured, there is a top level project, and that has a charter and a project management committee, and there are individual projects that belong to the top level project, right? And so the Eclipse IDE today is a top level project. There's an Eclipse modeling top level project. There are top level projects around automotive, and it's just a structure for related open source projects that puts a set of technical leaders over the top of that provide guidance, provide a little bit of oversight. Are you behaving correctly? And also help with the release process. And the way you create a project, there's typically somebody, like when we did the Johns Hopkins ones, just showed up in, I think, February or March of this year. There's internal work that happens with the participants and the Eclipse Foundation in this pre-proposal. We're sort of iterating on that, and then the proposal was made public. And then there's a creation review, and that happens at the Eclipse Foundation. And then once that creation review happens, we create the infrastructure. You get your Eclipse group. If you're doing a GitHub, you get your GitHub group. You get your projects. We put the right, access controls in place. We create the pages on the Eclipse website. We add the committers, all that basic GORPy stuff that you need to get an open source project started. And then it goes into this incubation phase. And that is basically helping the team learn. And if these are experienced open source developers, this is easy, right? You know how to behave, you know what you should do and what you shouldn't do. But if you're new to open source, it just helps to have a little bit of coaching, right? So that you behave appropriately. And then ultimately, after a certain period of time, and I think I've got that on the next slide, there's a graduation review. Okay, you guys, you're doing it right. Graduation review, you're mature now, sort of on your own. You control your own destiny. So I'll give you, for example. So early on, when we were bringing Eclipse into IBM, and we were still doing all that IBM stuff to make something that IBM products would put in a release. These guys, we had an internal contract. Okay, if you're going to include this stuff we're responsible for, you agree to do this, right? One of the things you agree is you agree to have some level of skill, either committer or access to a committer on your project. So if something goes wrong, you've got somebody who has the ability to fix it, or at least a fighting chance, right? And so we had, one manager, or product manager, I can't remember, had a defect called in by a customer. It was urgent, right? And an important customer, and couldn't get a fix, right? Can't remember why. But so this person attempted to escalate this random open source developer demand that they fix the problem, right? And so that, okay, back down, right? That's not how we do things, right? But that's an example where, just not really understanding how open source works, right? You might do the wrong thing. Right, so timeline. So you can see this community review about 2 weeks, creation review about 1 week. Yes, so incubation, 3 to 6 months, about typically what we see. Then this graduation review, and then the project goes on. And so to create a project, you create a project proposal document. Here's what's in it, right? All right, name, background, scope. Who are the project lead committers and mentors, licensees, any legal issues, initial contribution, and resources. Then part of the creation review is the Eclipse actually, and this is part of that the commercial influence that we all agreed that we would add to the Eclipse processes, is that initial contribution goes through a pretty thorough scan, source code scan and license check to make sure that we know everything that's going in. We know the licenses. More importantly, when if you're doing, for example, if you're doing JavaScript, let's do a transitive closure of all the dependencies and all the licenses and make sure we're not getting anything, anything bogus in there. Like if you, I can't remember what it's called. If you use this and you're in Denmark, you have to buy me a beer, right? That's a license someplace, or it's close to that. I don't know if that's exact words. That makes some corporate IP attorneys nervous. So anyway, but so this is what you do if you want to start. Yeah.
So if somebody can help with this document, or basically when you all put everything together?
No, so you will have help from Eclipse Foundation staff if this is what you want to do. Yeah.
To like figure out.
Yeah. So when the Johns Hopkins guys went through their process, I was working with them to do this. Yeah.
So in about mentors, so what is the qualification for mentors? Like somebody from the foundation?
We'll help identify that person. Yep.
Is this document also freely available, or is this a process that has to go through the Eclipse Foundation? In other words, if I wanted to create a project and I wanted to utilize a template like that, can I just pull that template down and utilize it, or do I need to reach out to Eclipse first for permission? How's that?
I think it is. I bet it is online. I haven't looked for it in a while, but when we're done, I'll look for it for you. Okay. Yep. Any questions? No. All right. I will be here for about another hour and a half. I'll certainly be around for coffee. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.